Today, we have the privilege of sitting down with Dr. Valter Longo, named by Time magazine as one of the 50 most influential people in health. He's widely considered the world's leading authority on the science of fasting, and what you're about to hear might completely reshape your understanding of the human body. Dr. Longo's groundbreaking research challenges some of the deepest assumptions we have about food and health. Number one, that going without food is harmful, and number two, that our bodies constantly need food as fuel, that we break down without frequent nourishment. Instead, what he discovered is stunning, that under the right conditions, fasting doesn't just keep us alive, it actively triggers our body's internal mechanisms to repair and regenerate itself. This insight holds profound implications for treating some of humanity's most feared diseases, including cancer, autoimmune disorders, and even multiple sclerosis. In this conversation, we'll cover the incredible science behind fasting, its transformative potential against disease, why it's still not mainstream healthcare, and the difference between water fasting and the innovative fasting mimicking diet. If you've been following us for a while, you know we exist to help you make sense of life by looking at the whole person, mind, body, and spirit. Not as vague wellness cliches, but as three practical areas of your everyday life, deeply interconnected, influencing how you feel, think, and live. So through fasting, today's episode zooms into a critical piece of your physical health. Before we dive in, I want to share something that hits really close to home. And honestly, it might be one of the single most important things you could ever do for your life. This is because we exist in a medical system built for quick fixes, 10-minute appointments, prescription pads, just enough to quiet the symptoms, but never enough to heal. Enough to keep things managed until disease breaks the barrier and takes over. That was me. I had some nasty gut issues for years, and I went the standard route, a conventional gastroenterologist. They handed me antacids, no testing, no questions, just pills, as if the symptom was a problem itself and not the signal. It wasn't until I discovered functional medicine that everything changed. They ran comprehensive tests, looked at my body as a whole system, gave me a natural evidence-based protocol that actually helped me heal. And that's at the core of what we talk about in our physical health content, the difference between symptom management and root cause healing. So here's why I'm telling you all this. ReWell, the sponsor for this episode, is a functional medicine practice that stands for everything we believe in. And honestly, it's kind of a dream to be partnered with them. ReWell offers multiple ways to get started through a yearly membership or the Foundations program. Both include multiple visits with a functional medicine doctor, comprehensive testing, and a personalized, science-backed plan for your health. And the testimonies, they're insane. This could be the difference between managing symptoms for the rest of your life or actually healing. So let's zoom out for a second. Passivity with your health leads to bad outcomes, not because you chose it, but because we live in a world that's designed to profit off your sickness. Ultra-processed foods surround you everywhere, a healthcare system built to manage and not heal, and a pharmaceutical industry that made $700 billion last year. We're not saying this because it's a conspiracy, but rather it is the cold, hard truth. And it is exactly what we touch on in this episode with Dr. Longo. ReWell is your opportunity to take your health and your future back, to turn passivity into proactivity. And trust me, it's worth the investment. So if you're ready to take that first step, you could sign up by scanning the QR code on the screen or visit the link below. Now let's get into the episode. Dr. Longo, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah. When I first came across your work, it was a number of years ago, but I was just stunned in terms of what you've uncovered about fasting. And it's like paradigm shifting in the sense that it challenges some of like the deeply most held assumptions about modern health, namely that like not eating is dangerous, food is always fuel, and that the body breaks down without constant input. And so your research suggests the opposite, that like under the right conditions, with precision and timing, that the body doesn't just survive, but like it can repair itself, which is just mind-blowing, like the implications, which we'll get into in terms of how that can impact disease and cancer and all these things. And what I think is interesting about this topic is that the vast majority of people like have not heard about it. More people are starting to hear about it. But with these types of findings, especially when you consider, the chronic disease epidemic in America and, the rush to develop so many different pharmaceuticals to treat all these diseases, you'd think that this would be front page news, and yet you don't hear about it. So that's kind of exactly how I felt when I discovered it.
Yeah.
So if you were to kind of take us back to the beginning, your lab, 1990s, like what did you start to see that kind of changed the direction of your work and led you like into this field?
Yeah. So actually, fasting now is the number one in the United States dietary intervention for health, right?
Yeah.
So it's over 10%
Yeah.
of the people that do something about health do it with fasting. So some type of fasting. So it's pretty big, right? So it's becoming fairly popular. What I think is not as popular is doing it the right way, right? So people like the word fasting, and then they associate the word fasting with something good, and then they do whatever it is that they come up with, and for however long. So yeah, so I started actually in the early 90s with Roy Walford, and Roy was a professor at UCLA, a medical doctor. And Roy was, at the time, the most famous person in the planet for nutrition and longevity. And he was, not surprisingly, working on something called calorie restriction, which was something much simpler, I think, than what we're doing now, but certainly related. But it was, what if you take a person or a monkey or a mouse, and this is, started with mice, and then it moved to monkeys and people, and you just reduce the calorie intake by about 25%. That's it. Very simple, below the normal level. And so what happens is you get a lot of benefits and you get a lot of problems. Right? And I think, unfortunately, people at the beginning, they focus on the benefits, right? All you see is benefits, but you don't want to see the problems. But to me, I saw the problems right away because they actually went into a place called Biosphere 2, and this was an environment that they built in the middle of the desert of Arizona. And then 8 people went into that environment, and they started the first human calorie-restricted study. Mm-hmm. And when they came out, I was there, and this was 1992 or 93, and they were, terrible. They looked terrible. So I thought, well, if you look at their cholesterol level, blood glucose level, anything that you can think of, it looked perfect. I mean, you've never seen 8 people so healthy, and yet they looked terrible. And so they were very thin and almost emaciated. So yeah, so that's where I started thinking there's got to be a way to get these incredible benefits on diabetes, pre-diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, which eventually this was shown for monkeys and in very long studies. So get all the benefits without the problems, right? So that was the beginning for me. Of course, I was doing research on calorie restriction and fasting, but I was also doing research on genetics. So what are the genes that control the aging process? So I actually left the Walford lab, went back to biochemistry, and in biochemistry I went back to very simple organisms, unicellular organisms like microbes essentially, and then we started manipulating their genes, and eventually extended the lifespan of a yeast by tenfold by two genetic manipulations plus fasting, right? So that was the origin for me in both. We were first doing some work in bacteria, and the bacteria, when I fasted, they lived a lot longer. And then when we saw that this record longevity, nobody had ever extended the lifespan of anything by more than a couple fold. And so this tenfold lifespan extension by this combination of genetic mutation and fasting, to me, it just told me something very fundamental here. We just need to find out how far we can take it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the interest around fasting has certainly exploded, but I think the piece that you don't hear in the news is the implications specifically for like your new book, like Fasting Cancer and stuff like that. That's not something that you hear. We're in a rush to get all like the pharmaceutical drugs or whatever, but I think the implications for disease specifically and cancer is like very, very interesting and very compelling. I mean, going through your entire book was just fascinating. Just seeing, and then also seeing the research, but then seeing the firsthand stories and case studies that went into people's use of water fasting or the fasting mimicking diet, which you have developed. And so as I started digging into the research, I thought what was interesting about the topic, specifically fasting, is like the science behind some of those types of fasting under controlled conditions isn't speculative in terms of like biologically what's happening in the body. We've identified like the processes. So like we're seeing real time what's happening in the body. And so can you walk us through kind of physiologically what happens like when we fast within the first 24 hours, 3 to 5 days, and why that would provide any benefit to us under certain circumstances?
Yeah, so a lot of things happen. And so for the past 20 years or so, I've been challenging everybody with the following. I challenge you to come up with something that will change more gene expression in the body than fasting, right? And nobody's ever even come up with something theoretically that could do that. What doesn't mean that everything changes, right? So for example, you have glycogen reserves, so this is basically sugar stored away, and these are depleted, let's say, in the first 24 hours. And then eventually, the body switches to utilizing fat, the stored fat, mostly the visceral fat, and that becomes your major fuel source, and this is broken down into fatty acids and ketone bodies. And so the brain, for example, after 3, 4, 5 days, begins to use progressively more of these ketone bodies, these byproducts of fat, for fuel. But now these ketone bodies turn out to have lots of effects. For example, they can stimulate stem cells. They may stimulate cellular reprogramming. So they have a role in making, in activating all kinds of programs. But I think that we also need to be careful and not underestimate the power of something that is being naturally evolving, meaning that this idea, why am I saying this? Because now there's an attempt, for example, to use ketone bodies to replace fasting, or use some drugs to do what fasting does. And so it's also, I think, important to understand that what happens during fasting is so coordinated, so precise, that it's going to be very difficult in the near future. I mean, eventually you will be able to do all kinds of things, but in the near future, it's going to be hard to beat this very sophisticated, coordinated programs that has the job essentially to shrink you. And for example, part of the shrinking process is something called autophagy, self-eating process, right? But it doesn't happen until, so I mentioned the glycogen, then the ketone bodies, the fatty acids. The autophagy doesn't seem to happen until day 5 or so, and this is why the fasting mimicking diet that we've been studying lasts 5 days. And so only at the end of that do you get clear evidence of self-eating. But so essentially, the body shrinks, there's a self-eating process, and then at the end of that, and I'm summarizing 20 years' work, at the end of that, you start seeing activation of stem cells, cellular reprogramming, and so following the autophagy, stem cell activation, cellular reprogramming, and then together during the refeeding, this process begins to repair and replace, right? And it does so in part by regenerating systems or part of systems. So, for example, recently we published on both rat and human study, and in rats we damaged the kidney with a toxin. And so if you look at the kidney that is damaged by the toxin, it becomes dysfunctional, and it becomes the gene expression pattern becomes disrupted, right? So it's no longer the normal kidney. And this is a fairly permanent damage. And we had shown this very similar for the pancreas earlier. So now you start the fasting mimicking diet cycles, and you see that the kidney goes back to normal function, and before doing that, it reestablishes this pattern. We call it a special transcriptomic. We use a technique called special transcriptomics to show that the cellular types and function goes back to normal. So every cell knows where to go. Because, again, this is not biohacking. This has always been there in response to, let's say, a kidney being damaged for whatever reason, maybe an infection, and so you have to rebuild it or repair it. and the body already has this innate ability to fix itself.
Yeah, I mean that's really interesting because I mean fasting is ancient, and so it's not like a new thing, and people have been doing it for thousands of years for various reasons. I think I was gonna mention the autophagy piece. So if you were to pretend that everybody listening is, I don't know, in kindergarten or something like that, grade school, like how would you explain what's actually happening in that? Is that a recycling of stuff that's happening in the body? What would be like the analogy there for what's actually happening with autophagy?
Yeah, the analogy I like to use the wood burning train, and so a wood burning train is running out of fuel, and so the engineer goes back in the train and grabs all the wood that is older, right, and uses it, and burns that to generate fuel, but also to make the train lighter, right? Mm-hmm. So that way you don't consume as much fuel, and the body itself, in the case of autophagy, becomes the fuel. So that makes a lot of sense, right? And that's what evolution has come up with. So essentially eat parts of the cell so that the cell is smaller, but you shrink it, and this is why the organs shrink and the person shrinks. And then so you now use yourself, eat yourself, right, as a cell, but you're also lighter and you don't need as much fuel to stay alive. And of course, what you want to do as a cell, you want to survive until the food comes back around, right? So then the food comes back around, the information is still there, and that's when you can expand and now regenerate organs or part of organs. Now there was a study done many years ago, I think in the 40s. This is called Minnesota, I think, was semi-starvation studies. Right? The type of studies that they'll never be allowed to do again. But this was Ansel Keys, and so they were semi-starving people after the war, and showing that some of these studies show that the patients that were semi-starved, their heart shrunk by over 40%. Right? So now you have somebody's heart shrinking by 40%, and you have to ask the question, well, what happens then? They refed and it goes back to normal. So what is it, 40% new heart? So it's very interesting, right? Is it possible that, and the heart is mostly a non-dividing organ, meaning the cells are not dividing. It's not like the liver. What happens, right? And can this be used to repair damaged organs? So very, very powerful. But
in terms of even if it's not widely recommended for everyone, like there are people who've done extended fasts under medical supervision, or even people who do it for religious reasons. Just from a biological perspective, you were discussing these stages. Day 5, you get to this point where autophagy starts kicking in. What happens at day 10 or day 20 if someone's on an extended fast, and is there any benefit to that?
Well, we don't know, right? So meaning there more of it happens. Eventually, you even earlier you start breaking down muscle. Eventually, you're going to start breaking down much more muscle. And part of this is because you want to give, by gluconeogenesis, you want to give fuel to the brain, sugar to the brain, even though the brain is using ketone bodies and sugar, it needs the sugar. So eventually you start doing damage. And also, I think that something that is very much underestimated, this is why I say the devil is in detail. Fasting is good, bad, and neutral. Eventually, you can enter, or you're likely to enter. This is actually a well-known New England Journal of Medicine paper. As part of this semi-starvation state or starvation state is the potential to switch into a thrifty mode. What does that mean? It means that eventually, if the body feels it's going to run out of food, right? It enters and it could be an epigenetically entered mode. What does it mean? That you actually long-term switch your metabolism into a lower energy expenditure mode. So that's a big problem, right? Because if you enter this thrifty mode, it could take you years to exit it. Why? Because the body is more worried, it may make you lethargic, but it's more worried about not running out of food. So now, and this is why we keep the FMD to 5 days, and we give you food, say 800 to or 400 to 1100 calories, depending on what we're trying to do with different diseases, different composition. But so we want people not to enter this thrifty mode, because again, if you enter it, it could be a switch that is very difficult to turn back. And so this New England paper has shown that you eventually lose weight, but then you start now lowering your metabolism even when you adjust it for the new weight that you've gained. So let's say you lose 10% of the weight, you reduce your metabolic rate by 20%. And that's a problem, particularly if it lasts years. And now this is very clear that is happening. So yeah, you see the devil is in the detail. You want to get the benefits, that's what I was saying earlier. You get the benefits. You don't want to get the problems. And this is just one of the problems. Other problem is a lot of people, a minority of people could get in trouble, by doing, say, 10 days or 15 days of fasting. So you don't know how different people respond. And so the longer you go, the more a minority of people are going to be negatively affected, in addition to what I just mentioned, this low energy expenditure mode.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the fat reserves in the body, like what's actually happening during fasting, when I started looking into the subject, I was like very shocked to learn that in terms of the world record, someone went 382 days without eating. Mm-hmm. And I was like, how is that possible? They fasted for 382 days. Like, how is that possible that the human body could go an entire year without eating? And then, I learned that they started at like 400 pounds, but I think that kind of speaks a little bit to like the biological process of what the body's actually doing, because there was so much reserve. Is that the case? Like, how would it be possible that someone could fast for that long?
Yeah, I mean, of course, if they were 400 pounds, it's very, very much possible. Very dangerous even for the 400-pound person. But in this case, it went well. And so, but that's definitely something that you wouldn't want to recommend, especially because most likely, forget doing it for a year. But even if you did it for a month, most people will regain that weight, right? And part of it would be this low energy expenditure mode. So once you enter that, then it will be so very difficult to maintain that low weight, because you're not burning calories, and so you will store a lot of the energy or the calories you take in as fat, right? So then you go back, and that's exactly what your brain wants you to do. After you do that, it wants you to regain the weight and go back to where you were safe and stable, even if that's overweight or obese, right? So the evolution looks at obesity as a good thing, right? Keep in mind that 20,000 years ago, if you made it to 52, that's a big achievement, right? Evolution doesn't care about 100-year-old people. They care about a 52-year-old that has generated 15 offspring. So I think that it's very important to keep evolution in mind when we're thinking about these things, right? Yeah, so you don't want to, obesity is perfectly fine, and the push is to get you back to that safe zone where you have plenty of food, so the fasting comes back around, you're ready again, right? So you lost the weight. If you stay there, and now the system, of course, is very worried that this already happened for 100 days or whatever. It's going to happen again. Am I ready for the next one? Well, the only way you could be ready if you regained everything, right? And that's exactly what your brain. This is why people that lost a lot of weight oftentimes say, "I'm hungry all the time. I don't know why, but I can't stop eating." Right? Well, that's your brain ordering you to eat as much as possible, because that's a life and death decision. According to evolution.
How would someone? I mean, even if you are, you're overweight, how would someone not starve to death if they didn't eat for a year? Like that's the assumption for me. It doesn't matter how big you are, you would think that you would just starve to death.
Well, you wouldn't starve to death if you were weighing 400 pounds. Most people can go a couple months, right? So most people
Without eating
without
completely?
eating. Yeah, without eating. I mean, then you die, right? But but probably takes about 45 to 60 days will take 45 to 60 days for most people to die of starvation. But yeah, a year means that you have a lot of reserves and a lot of luck, right? And also sometimes these records were achieved by, eating some things, right? So you hear fasting, but then they had broths or they had different things that the people don't necessarily know about.
So that's the upper limit then, 45 to whatever you said, 60 days?
45 to 60 days, I would say the great majority of people will probably make it in that range, depending on your starting point. So if somebody started, with BMI, body mass index of 17,
Yeah.
you're probably not going to go more than 30 days. But, the average person in the United States, maybe have a BMI of 26, probably can go, or Europe for that matter, right? Can go a couple months.
So basically, then that means that the body is, so if I go eat lunch right now, the body is taking that as fuel. The body is basically eating itself, like the fat reserves, as the fuel.
Yeah, I mean, the fat reserves are fat reserves, right? It's like your tank, your fuel tank, right? It's not eating yourself. It's just eating it's using the fuel that you put away. So once that is starting to go down, or as that it goes down, then you also begin the process of eating yourself, right? And that includes muscle, includes the heart, includes the liver. So everything shrinks, right? With the exception, if you look at the calorie restriction studies in mice and rats, with the exception of the brain. The brain doesn't seem to shrink. I mean, at least not volume-wise. It may shrink cell type-wise. So some cells might go down in numbers, but if you look at if you do imaging analysis, you don't see the brain becoming smaller.
So as you've progressed in these last 30 years, so when you look at the actual biology of what's happening in the body, like what are the core assumptions that are being challenged?
Yeah, I think some of them we've mentioned, right? So I mean, a lot of it is assumption, right? And what we just talked about, the thrifty mode. Most people don't know that, right? And so there's a lot of data. You have to sort of put all the data together and then turn something that is good and bad in just good, right? And that's what you want. And so I think that it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of basic research, and it takes a lot of clinical work to then, and some of it you're not going to know until you wait and do the clinical trials. For example, I purposely in the fasting mimicking diet kept starches fairly high, right? And why? Because people say, well, if I'm fasting, why are there carbon sources that provide sugars essentially, right? And I mean, they're not sugars, but they are they can generate sugars. And so people will eat the fasting mimicking diet and then see the sugar in the blood go up. And so I did it in part because I didn't want this yo-yo high ketone bodies, low ketone body. I was worried that eventually this very high ketone body, very low ketone body, that would just cause problems to people. But then we started looking at the data and we said, maybe by chance we hit something very important, which is it seems to be protecting the muscle. And so it's possible, and now we're getting more and more evidence for that those, having a fasting mimicking diet that still has a, pretty good level of carbohydrates may be helping get the fasting response without the muscle loss, right? And so now trial after trial, we don't see patients losing muscle. So I think that's just an example of how some things you can think about and you can use theory for. Some things you just have to clinically test it, and then eventually you come up with personalized fasting practices that are just good for that person or for that category of people. And this is the type of intervention that I think should move into mainstream medicine, right? For the first time in history, by the way, right? It never happened. Why did it never happen? Because it was a lot of improvisation. And eventually, it was in the United States already 150 years ago. There were doctors saying, "Oh, you should fast for this and that," and they fasted, and everybody covered, all the newspapers covered them fasting for 100 days or 200 days, but eventually it got to the medical field, and the doctor said, absolutely not. We don't see any evidence for this working. It seems dangerous to us. So then the doctors have always waited for lots of trials, lots of preclinical research, lots of clinical research. And now for the first time in history, we see them saying, wait a minute, this looks very powerful, right? And like when we saw yesterday, I presented it at the New York Academy of Science, and these data on the kidney, right? And it's very surprising, right? That you could damage permanently, what I mentioned earlier, right? Damage the kidney, and then you refeed, and the fasting mimicking diet in this case is able to reestablish a normal functional kidney. So the doctors are now looking at that and say, that's almost impossible with the type of medicine, the drug-based medicine that we have been using. How do you rebuild the kidney, right? And can you do it with stem cells? No, the stem cells don't know where to go. Can you do it with Yamanaka factor reprogramming? No, I mean, this is, there's a lot of talk about reprogramming. Well, no. How do you know which cells you can reprogram? How do you reprogram it, right? So it's like, well, if you use this intervention in the right way, the body already knows how to do it itself, right? So it doesn't mean it can fix everything, but it's starting to look like it can fix a lot of things, right? And so we just have to see how far we can take it.
One thing that was surprising to me, another person I've followed his work was Dr. Peter Attia, and so another name in like the longevity space. So his book came out a couple years ago, and there was this one line, probably without the book, that kind of surprised me. He wrote that the scientific literature on fasting is still relatively weak. And so knowing kind of the body of what you're talking about right now, that kind of stopped me in the tracks about like, why would he potentially say that? And I mean, part of that maybe because of the muscle repair thing, but there is this growing body of evidence. So why would he make a claim like that?
I think he said the right thing, right? I think he's a doctor, he's a medical doctor, and that's exactly what I was saying earlier, right? As a medical doctor, he wants to see lots of trials. The standard is FDA, right? Now, there is really no FDA approval process for a diet, but you could get pretty close to that. And then I think at that point, then doctors will say, looks good. Yeah. So for example, for diabetes now, we're at trial number 6. Most of them were independent, University of Heidelberg, University of Leiden, University of Rome. So eventually you get enough data that doctors will say, come on, it's been, you've tested on 1,500 people, randomized crossover, and in independent universities, and it keeps on working the same way. So yeah, absolutely, I agree with Peter. Well, of course, I disagree if he means that. I agree with him also on the muscle loss. If you do it the wrong way, absolutely, and this is what I was saying earlier. Yeah, you do potentially you do 16 hours of fasting every day. You do calorie restriction. Lots of things are gonna make you lose muscle mass. Now, with the fasting mimicking diet, remember what I just said, that it may be the trick, it may just be the starches that we have in there that are now, so one thing that you need in muscle synthesis is you need enough of TOR activity to trigger muscle synthesis. And And so it may be that the starches are contributing to keeping TOR high enough so that you don't have a lot of muscle loss. We don't know. I mean, I'm speculating, but yeah. So absolutely, fasting and calorie restriction we know can cause muscle loss. That's why you need to have the right type of fasting and for the right length of fasting.
Yeah.
And so we need to move away from the word fasting, essentially, right? And begin to talk about exactly what are we talking about, right? So if we're talking about, let's say, a 5-day fasting mimicking diet, okay, what is it good for? And which type are we using, right? Because, for example, Stanford now, University of Miami, and another paper we have also with Stanford are going to publish on autoimmunities, right? But autoimmunity fasting mimicking diet is very, very different from the regular fasting mimicking diet. Right? So why? Well, I mean, we'll explain it in the papers, but there are foods that in the regular fasting mimicking diet that may not be ideal for somebody that has an autoimmunity. So for people with autoimmunities, we remove lots of different ingredients that we think that can contribute or help perpetuate the autoimmunity. So for example, celiac disease, right? And for the longest time, people didn't know what it was. It was an autoimmunity. And then, there's a few doctors started to speculate, maybe it's food, right? And then eventually, it was gluten. But it took a long time for people to figure out that. And of course, the medical community thought, this is crazy. It couldn't possibly be something that is in bread and pasta that is giving people an autoimmunity. Well, sure enough, it was, right? And so I think that the devil is in the detail. And the sooner we move away from words like fasting, the quicker we're going to get the medical community to accept it and use it instead of, say, or in addition, or let's say instead in addition of the GLP-1s, et cetera, right? Because right now, the view is that's all you got, right? And that's not it, right? That's not true. That's not all you got. So it's like either you change diet and you starve to that, or you're going to have GLP-1 receptor agonist, right? That's just not the way we should do. We should do science and we should do medicine.
Yeah, I mean, I think from a general public standpoint, though, I mean, there's these umbrella terms: nutrition, exercise, sleep, fasting. So from a umbrella term like putting it in a bucket type of thing of what are we generally talking about here? Like, do you feel like there's a utility aspect to that in terms of just understanding like the area domain that we're talking about with fasting? Because there are a million, I mean, with each of those buckets, when you talk about nutrition and exercise as well, there's like a million different things that like break out into that. There's a million different debates, like with nutrition as well. I mean, you start talking about, we were talking off camera about high protein this or going vegan or someone who's fully vegetarian, or like what's the evidence for all these different things, and then processed foods and all these different things that manipulate nutrition. It seems like what you're saying with fasting is there's just as much nuance or even more nuance in terms of what actually is beneficial to the human body as all those other categories.
Yeah, I think if you look at exercise, maybe less of a problem, right? Because we know that, you can have just physical activity, like walking is good for you. And, if you walk more, probably
but you could overdo it, right?
You could overdo it, but I think it's less likely that you're going to get into danger zone by being physically active. I mean, there's not a lot of examples of that, But yeah, there are, but a lot less likely. With fasting, it's kind of like taking not a medicine, but a cocktail of drugs, right? Yeah. So now you can see that that's how powerful it is, right? If you just think about 24 hours glycogen depletion, 72 hours, ketone bodies start going up, 5 days, autophagy start occurring, the body completely. So this is something that is not you don't get with anything else, right? Even a very powerful cocktail of drugs will not get you probably no more than 10% of that. So when you have that kind of revolution in the body, you want to make sure you get it right? Because that revolution can work for you or it can work against you. And I think that with exercise, you're not going to see that kind of a revolution. You're going to see changes, very beneficial changes. But if you run a mile or you run 5 miles or you run 10 miles, that's much harder to get into trouble, right? Than, on day 3, you become hypoglycemic and you pass out while you're driving, right? That's a kind of danger that you can have by, let's say, doing a water-only fasting and not understanding.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about things that I've seen happening, right? So this is why traditionally water-only fasting was done in clinics that are specialized in water-only fasting, because you're in a clinic, you're not driving, and they give you some food to make sure you don't become hypoglycemic, or they check you, But so now you take that same thing that people might have been doing for 100 years in a clinic, and you take it to somebody in Manhattan. How is that person going to respond, right? And then is it okay if 1 in 100 ends up passing out?
Yeah.
Right? No, it's not, right? So and it's probably higher than that eventually, because don't forget, this is not the first time you do it. You have to look at it. Let's say you did it for 10 years. Is that going to ever happen to you? It might not happen to you now, but maybe in the summer it's hot, and yes, then you're on day 4 of a water-only fasting, and you're going to end up on the street passed out. And this happens all the time, right? So this is why you want to move in with fasting mimicking diets and nutritionists and doctors, et cetera, And people say, oh, but this is overdoing it. It's not overdoing it, right? Because again, we cannot afford that. You're going to be, it's just a matter of time before you're going to be in trouble.
Yeah, we're talking about how fasting could be good, bad, or neutral under certain circumstances, and you could challenge me on this, but when I think about all those different categories, like I see that with all these categories that pertain to our physical health, so nutrition, exercise, sleep, right? So someone could make a generalized statement about any of these things, like just exercise as much as you want, whatever, and then all of a sudden you're doing these like high intensity workouts constantly, and then you get to a point where maybe there could be an adverse effect because of the way the stress that you're putting on your body, because of you're literally like overdoing it in terms of working out. And then with sleep, you could make a generalized statement that, well, sleep is good for you, but then you get to a point where it's like you shouldn't be sleeping 10 hours a day every day or 11 hours a day. And then with nutrition as well, there's so much nuance in terms of what you eat, how to eat it, like with things to avoid. So with fasting, are you saying that the stakes are raised in terms of the likelihood that you're going to run into a bad outcome is higher than all of these categories if you were just operate normally within it?
Yeah, I think it's much higher, not just higher,
okay.
Much higher, right? So because again, you have something that is now turning on autophagy, is turning on stem cells, is turning on cellular reprogramming. Yeah. So you can sleep 10 hours or 8 or 7. There is not an urgent need to intervene. It's unlikely that if you do it for 3 days, that's going to hurt you. In this case, as I just mentioned, if you did it for 3 days, it could hurt you. You could end up, passing out with hypoglycemia and hypotension. And of course, with exercise, I think if you did not use common sense, right? In the exercise example, you could get in trouble, but there would be a clear lack of common sense, right? So to get in trouble with exercise, like it's 105 degrees. And you're gonna run 20 miles. So I think,
or like marathons.
Yeah,
yeah,
fine, right? So but let's say very hot, and now you're gonna run a marathon without being trained. It's just common sense that you wouldn't do that. In the case of fasting, it's not common sense, because most people will say, "This is good for me. It's healthy for me. I didn't know. Nobody told me that I could become hypoglycemic and hypotense and pass out just because I'm going up the stairs, right? It's a different level, right? But sure, you can have anything that can get you in trouble. But I think this is so powerful that it's much more likely to get you into trouble. And some of the trouble could be short term. Some of the trouble could be long term. Like I was saying, yo-yo between very high ketone bodies, very low ketone bodies. What is the consequence of that long term? Well, nobody knows. And if you look at the negative literature on breakfast keeping, there is there are meta-analysis associating those that fast for let's say 16 hours, 18 hours, and skip breakfast, associated with shorter lifespan and increased cardiovascular disease. This meta-analysis. This is not one study; it's many studies. Very, very consistent. So, what happened there, right? And so all of a sudden now something that everybody thought was so good, it turns out to be not so good. So, we've been saying this for a long time. Using the 5-pillar system, we always say don't do 16 hours, do 12 hours. But that was the thinking, right? So we don't know what the 16 hours are going to bring. There's not enough data. Don't do it yet, right?
When I originally read the longevity thought, I thought those pillars were so fascinating because of how they a lot of how they relate to each other, almost like a checks and balances thing. And if I remember correctly, when you wrote the book, it was like, is this actually a theory of how you could approach this that would last 50 years from now? And I love that type of thinking. But one thing that just came up now, when you were speaking, is if someone's listening to this and they're whatever, spiritual or religious, and they're like, I'm a Muslim or I'm a Christian and I do 21-day fast, or that has been part of humanity for a very long time, that people have been doing those types of things. What would you say about that, especially if they don't see any danger or they just see it as a normal thing that you do?
I would say that keep in mind that it is dangerous if you do it outside of a clinic. Keep in mind that even if you do it in a clinic, we don't know the long-term consequences, like what I mentioned earlier. Are you going to get into thrifty mode? And is your metabolism going to slow? And then are you going to be hungry all the time? Are you going to regain all the weight and maybe regain more weight than you had before? So as long as you know the consequences and you think about it and you still make that decision, it's like, hey, when we found out how bad cigarettes were for our health, half of the people kept smoking, right? Okay, that's what they want to do. That's what they do, right? So it doesn't need to be a religious reason. It could be just, I like smoking. and that's it. So we tell people all the time that, do 16 hours and skip breakfast. Most of them don't change it. They're used to skipping breakfast. They like it. And so they I think it's bad if they didn't realize that that's the association. And if you find excuses, it's not true, or, well, it is true, it's a clear association. Now, you will have alternative explanations for, maybe the people that skip breakfast also have, bad habits but that doesn't, the new clinical trials suggest that that's not the case. That's probably something.
We dropped the word fasting mimicking diet a couple times, and so if people aren't familiar, that was something that you had created, an intervention that actually kind of offsets a lot of the negative aspects of water fasting, and then by adopting the fasting mimicking diet, you're reaping a lot of the benefits. And so you can explain what that is and how it actually works and why it minimizes risk in doing this?
Yeah, so the idea of the fasting mimicking diet started with cancer patients. So we were doing a clinical trial in USC Norris Cancer Center, and it was on water-only fasting. Mm-hmm. And we thought, cancer patients are going to be highly motivated, so no problem. But then when we started the trial, nobody wanted to do water-only fasting. And it was very surprising to us. And so then we went to the National Cancer Institute, the National Institute on Aging, And then we proposed, let us develop a fasting mimicking diet because probably the patients felt cheated and the oncologists were worried. So this was the reality, right? So yeah. So the fasting mimicking diet then originally had that job. Can we get the effects of fasting? And we were looking at 4 different markers, one called IGF-1, IGF-PP1, ketone bodies, and glucose. We were looking at changes that would be evidence of a fasting response, of an executed fasting response. So we saw that, and there was the fasting mimicking diet. There was the original version of it. But then we started looking at it more like food as medicine. We said, well, we've been talking about food as medicine for 2,000 years, but there's really not, there's some examples of that, but not in mainstream medicine. Mm-hmm. And so, then we started saying, well, and this also was justified or triggered by one of the former FDA directors. And he said to me one time, we were discussing about fasting mimicking diet and why it works. And I said, well, I know why it works. Because we were talking about trial, right, on cancer. And he said, no, you don't, right? And he had a very good point. It made me think about what if there is an ingredient in there that without which you're not going to get the effects.
Yeah.
So you have the fasting part, but without that ingredient, you're not going to get the effects. And we saw evidence for that in a study that we did on inflammatory bowel disease, right, Crohn's, colitis, in mice, where we use water-only fasting, and then we use the fasting mimicking diet. And the fasting mimicking diet works so much better than the water-only fasting. In fact, water-only fasting increased the leakiness of the gut. And then when we looked at the reversal of the effects of this inflammatory bowel disease, the FMD, the fasting mimicking diet, was much superior. And we showed that it was probably the prebiotic ingredients that were feeding the bacteria, the bifidobacteria, lactobacillus. So the vegan diet, or essentially fasting mimicking diet, was feeding the bacteria that were now populating the gut. And so I think the original idea was, let's not just make a fasting mimicking, let's make a fasting mimicking by using ingredients that we will see in the longest lived areas of the world, right? Southern Italy, Loma Linda, Okinawa. And that was my idea, and it was a good idea, right? Because I wasn't thinking too much about it, but I thought, what if somebody does this all the time? I wouldn't just want to mimic fasting, I would want it to mimic fasting in a very healthy way, right? And so that was probably a good idea, and that was at least some initial evidence that there was good thinking, because now, this prebiotic of this healthy diets are feeding the right bacteria and not the wrong bacteria.
So in the fasting mimicking diet, basically, if I understand this correctly, it's tricking the body into activating the same processes as fasting, but with the fasting mimicking diet, you're reducing your caloric intake to very low levels, and so it's at a bare minimum, but you're still eating, and it's tricking the body into those same exact processes. So then you don't have that. I mean, many people are familiar with the first 3 to 5 days are just absolutely brutal of the water fasting. Probably partially why those cancer patients didn't want to do that, because it's so tough on the body, like those first 3 to 5 days. Am I tracking correctly?
Yeah, it's not just tough on the body, it's tough on the mind, right?
Yeah.
So people are used to having breakfast and lunch and dinner and snacks, right? So that's a psychological issue too of, you're not having the breakfast that you're normally having, but you're having breakfast, right? So, and, most people are okay with that. So if you travel, you're probably not going to have the breakfast that you normally have, but, you want to have breakfast. So, so there's a lot of components that go into the generation of a fasting mimicking diet. Of course, then we're finding out, and there are lots of different fasting mimicking diets, by the way. Cancer patients have something very different from Alzheimer's patient, from autoimmune disease, as I mentioned earlier, from diabetes. So in each case, we're looking at what is the disease we're trying to treat, and what are the problems associated, and how do we modify the FMD so that it's best for that particular patient. For example, for Alzheimer, we had to increase. For Alzheimer, we knew there were data on ketogenic components triggering, having benefits in mouse models and also early clinical trials. So we had and we also knew that we were dealing with people that are much older. So we didn't want to have a 800 to 1,100 kilocalorie diet for somebody who's 82 and has Alzheimer. So we raised it by 300 calories a day, and then we gave them a supplement every day that was ketogenic in nature, right? So now we have a fasting mimicking diet plus a ketogenic supplement, and that's what we tested in the trial that we just finished in Italy.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to get into kind of the clinical results. I mean, your latest book, the English version, obviously just came out of Fasting Cancer. And, when you look at the results and the case studies in that book, your jaw just drops in terms of the correlation between operating under this regimen for a period of time when people actively have cancer. I love how you broke it up into all these different chapters of many different types of cancer and how this interacts with it. And so can you explain, if someone has cancer, what actually is happening in the body when they start fasting? What's the mechanism and why is it effective?
Well, first of all, for a lot of cancers, and most cancers, we don't have proof that it's effective, right? We have it for mice, right? So, and this is what I try to do in the book. I try to basically say it's working exceptionally well in mice, even better than immunotherapy, right? So if you look at in the mouse, immunotherapy doesn't work as well as fasting mimicking diet in the mouse, right? Of course, immunotherapy now is very well established too, and chemotherapy also. A cycle of fasting mimicking diet in a mouse is as good as a cycle of chemotherapy, and better than a cycle of immunotherapy.
Which is that's my mind.
Yeah, right. But it's a mouse, right?
Yeah.
And so people say, okay, well, now you got to do the work. Yeah, I understand that. And so that's the point. But, if you're a cancer patient and you cannot wait 12 years and $1 billion just to test one of the 100 cancers, then the point I make in the book is if you're running out of time and your oncologist tells you, we don't have anything that is likely to work for you, right? Okay, now that's the time to start looking at the fasting mimicking diet and say, okay, let's combine it with whatever you got, because you're already telling me that we don't have anything that's going to work very well. So let's take that now very well and combine it with the fasting mimicking diet. Let's see if I get lucky and I get the same effects that we see in mice, right? So, of course, there's clinical trials. There's, I think, 20 trials now that have been done for fasting mimicking diet and fasting in cancer. And you're starting to see for triple-negative breast cancer metastatic setting, the Vernieri group and the Broad, they showed almost a doubling of overall survival. So, small trials, but, already started seeing, that it's working well. But that's one type of cancer in one stage, right? Advanced stages. So what about earlier stages? We don't know, and so I think people should stick with the standard of care. There's a high chance that the standard of care is going to work. Stay with that, and but then think about it as a wild card, right? So if that whatever you got is not working, then you might want to use the wild card. Yeah.
What there was many case studies in the book, but if you had to just take one, like what would it be that just completely blew your mind, in terms of the results of doing this that you would highlight?
Yeah, certainly this story, J.J. Trochon is a Air France airline pilot, right, with stage 4 kidney cancer. And that's what I just mentioned happened to him. That Bernard Escudier is oncologist at Gustave Roussy in Paris, basically said, we're out of options here, right? So then J.J. Trochon gets his surgery where they basically take his lungs out of his body and then remove all the cancers. But he does that after, I think, a 12-day fast or something like that, right? And And so, so they did the surgery and they remove all the cancers. And, again, these oncologists are thinking it's going to come back and you're going to be in trouble. But so he ends up doing this many times. And this was like 15 years ago. And now the masses, it's metastatic, so we're everywhere, have calcified, right? And so everybody's looking at this and saying, well, is it possible? So, but I don't want to, do that and give, false hopes. But I think you want to sort of give hope and not false hope, right? It's a little tricky. And for that, I really like the report that was published by the National Cancer Institute in Milan. And this is the same group. When I presented like 15 years ago, they look at me like, this is crazy. Why are you talking about fasting and cancer? So now they did a 100 people trial. And in the 100 people trial, I think there were like 20 people that were advanced stage metastatic, right? And out of the 20 people, 5, I think it was lung, breast, colorectal, and pancreatic, right? 5 patients, 4 different types of cancers. And they went into remission. And they thought, this is not, you could get 1 by chance, right? It goes into remission, but you have 5 patients in stage 4, going into remission in the same trial. And so they published that, and they call it exceptional responses in cancer therapy. So I think that, again, this is not a replacement for a randomized clinical trial, and they're doing it, and lots of other hospitals are doing it. And so you have to, say, hey, it may or may not work, but certainly that's very promising, what I said earlier, but in the mice that works better than chemo, it works better than immunotherapy, and also seeing some of these, including pancreatic cancer, now going into remission. So that means it can happen, or J.J. Trochon, or Maggie Jones, and there's a lot of cases in the book that we talked about. So it can happen, and so obviously, if you're a cancer patient, you want to say, well, what if it happened to me, right? So,
the way I look at it, I don't think there really is a risk of giving false hope, because at the end of the day, if someone tells you have stage 4 cancer and you're going to die, like what do you have to lose at the end of the day? I think is essentially you're basically, they're telling you have like 1% odds. Like, to your point, you should be exploring every possible avenue that could possibly help. And I think one of our guests a few months ago was Dr. William Lai, and it was all about cancer, and we were talking about basically the standardized care for cancer today, and chemotherapy. And there was a lot of through lines, what you talked about in your book, of like, we don't talk about the downsides of all these things. And so there's kind of like just this visceral metaphor of like, kill the cancer. And what is that doing to like some of the more healthy parts of your body? And so with what he was saying, with what you were saying, this idea of moving towards something that is taking and picking some of the best options and modalities for and being more precise in terms of like how we're actually treating these things. And I think what you're talking about with fasting can be one of those components, because people just don't have time. You don't have time to wait 20 years to like wait for a clinical trial and have the cancer today in 2025,
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're stage 4, then that's what I was saying earlier, right? Then you definitely need to go to your oncologist. And we have foundation clinics in Europe and the United States. So it's Create Cures. It's a nonprofit, and that's exactly what they do. Help a lot of cancer patients, not just cancer patients, but patients with that are in trouble with multiple nutrition and lifestyle-based integrative intervention that are combined with the standard of care. And that's what I think. That's what the patient should look at. Now, more and something much more sophisticated is coming, and now so that's what we used to do, right? So now we're moving to the technology, which is, what if and we just published several papers on that, what if you use the fasting mimicking diet, but you're not using it and you use the standard of care, but you're not using it to get the job done, but you're using it to find out how the cancer stays alive. And now with technology, you can do this, and soon enough, I think you'll be able to do it in a couple hours, right? So in a couple hours, you can find out how is the cancer staying alive in response to, let's say, fasting mimicking diet and immunotherapy, or fasting mimicking diet plus chemotherapy. And now, once you find out what we call starvation escape pathways, you can target them with approved drugs that are low toxicity, right? So that's what we're very excited about, because this now can go after every cancer in a very powerful way. I mean, of course, there is always an ugly fact that could, dampen my enthusiasm. But I think that, right now we're using a lot of mouse model, and it looks very, very promising. So you use this to force all kinds of cancers, and even the same cancer within the same patient in two different stages of the patient's progression of the cancer, right? Now you could have, let's say in May, you could have one cancer, and in September, now you have an evolved cancer. So now we can look at it in May and say, okay, now this is how we block the escape pathways in May. And in September, don't worry about it, we're gonna block them this way, right? Which could be a completely different set of drugs. So I like to think of this as like cancer antibiotics, right? So I envision, in a maybe delusional way, I envision you go to the doctor and the doctor says, oh, you have cancer, right? So we'll give you this and see how you respond. And then, if this doesn't work like you have for antibiotics, then we'll try the different kind, right? So again, I want to give false hopes, but I think this is, ours, of course, is one approach. There are many others that are now moving much faster than it used to move in the past. So I think it's important to also keep in mind that I have to stay alive for one of these to work much better. And that was certainly the case for immunotherapy and melanoma, right? So for the melanoma, a patient with melanoma were in big trouble. And many of them are, but some of them now are being, surviving or are surviving long-term thanks to immunotherapy.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting, I was looking into like your theory around the cancer cells and the healthy cells. And so it seems like essentially what you found with mice is that what happens when you adopt a fasting or fasting mimicking diet while having cancer, is it that the cancer cells get attacked, but then the body goes into a self-protective mechanism with the healthy cells? And am I tracking with that correctly? And then has that been demonstrated in human trials as well?
Yeah, I mean, the normal cells, because of 3 billion years of evolution of these responses, starvation responses, which started in bacteria, the normal cells will go into a fasting response mode. So the slow cell division, maybe lower metabolism, some of the things that we were talking about earlier. And the cancer cells, by definition, they refuse that. That's the definition of cancer cells. It refuses anti-growth signals, right? So now you have anti-growth signal, normal cells go on one side, and cancer cells refuse it. So this is obviously a very much underappreciated way to distinguish all normal cells from all cancer cells, right? Because the cancer cells are the one that disobey. And so you can pick them apart. But now because they disobey, that puts them in trouble if you know what to do, right? So I always use the analogy or the example of, putting a million people in the desert or 1 billion people in the desert, if you want to exaggerate. So you put 1 billion people in the desert and you give them no food, no water, and no shade, right? And then you make them run, right? And make them run. And then, if any of these are reversed, let's say you put them in the shade, some can survive, right? You're running, but you're in the shade with no water. You're gonna survive a little bit, but you're eventually gonna die, but you're gonna survive. But certainly, if you have, no water, and you're running and you're under the sun, even if it's 1 billion people, and you imagine 1 billion cancer cells, they're all gonna die, 100% of them, right? And so I think that that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to change the environment in the body that, the normal cells, they're not running. They know how to stop running. So, the people in the desert stop running. And they stand by and they wait for the food, right? But the cancer cells, now we have to exploit this sort of dumb nature of a cancer cells. It says, there is no food, glucose is getting low, but I keep going, right? And so what does the hospital do usually? It just gives them more sugar, right? More food, more amino acids. So the cancer cells like lots of amino acids, lots of sugars. And so by overfeeding the patient, yes, you may be helping the patient a little bit because the patient is maybe malnourished, but you're helping the cancer cells a lot more, right? So, but even if you remove that, that's not enough, right? With the fasting. That's where the standard of care needs to come in, and that's the sun, right? The standard of care comes in and just puts an end to it because, you have low sugar, you have low amino acids, but the cancers are still pretty good at surviving, right? Unless now you hit them with the best shot you got. And usually we see that that's what everybody else came up with. So if it's, let's say, breast cancer, triple negative, let's say doxorubicin or cyclophosphamide, right? So whatever the science field came up with, works the best once you now combine it with the fasting mimicking diet. And so I think that the most powerful part is differential effects between all normal cells, no matter where they are, and all cancer cells, no matter where they are.
Yeah, I mean that was one of the core distinctions that you made in the book was that it wasn't just doing fasting or fasting mimicking diet on its own, but it was also in tandem with if you're doing immunotherapy or whatever. And so were you basically saying that fasting alone won't kill the cancer potentially, that it needs to be paired with something else?
Yeah, I always say that we never cure the cancer with fasting alone, right? And the only time you kind of see that is with some type of blood cancers, right? Some type of blood cancers, lymphomas, etc. They seem to be particularly sensitive to fasting. Other than that, you just slow down. It's like one cycle of fasting mimicking diet or fasting is equivalent to one cycle of chemo. The cancer slow down, but it'll still grow, and eventually the mouse dies, right? And so I think that we see cancer-free survival when we combine it with the most powerful therapy that is being developed for that particular cancer. And so we always match it with, so if it's colorectal cancer, and maybe one type of chemo. If it's melanoma, it may be immunotherapy. If it's hormone receptor positive breast cancer, it may be hormone therapy plus fasting mimicking diet. And this actually we published, a paper in mice that also had a human trial attached to it. So it's hormone therapy. Something called fulvestrant, and then palbociclib. And so the mice, if you give them these two drugs, the tumor was kept down, let's say, and then it started progressing. It became resistant and started progressing. But when we added the fasting mimicking diet cycles, instead of becoming resistant and progressing, it started going down and down and down, and then until you start seeing mice becoming cancer-free. So that's a wild card, right? So now you add in that third, and now the interesting thing in that paper was that it will have taken 3 more drugs to achieve what fasting mimicking diet achieved, because it was lowering insulin, it was lowering IGF-1, it was lowering leptin, and all 3 lowerings were required together with the 2 first drugs. So it's 2 drugs already given to the mice or to the patients. And so the 2 drugs block it, but then cancer progresses. Now, there were 3 more factors in the cancer cells that had to be kept down for the cancers to start coming down. This is why, if you look at it from that point of view, you will say, good luck with that, right? When would you have, and it's not like, first of all, you couldn't give most patients 5 drugs because it'd be too much, it'd be too toxic. Yeah. And even if you could, then one patient might need those 5 drugs, another patient might need another set of drugs, right? And this is why you can see how we have to start thinking differently also in cancer treatment.
I mean, as you're speaking, I mean, just a huge problem like comes to mind for me. I think with what you're discussing, it just feels like if this was a pharmaceutical drug that was developing these types of results, like wouldn't everybody be like throwing like hundreds of millions of dollars of funding behind it? I mean, even one of your colleagues, Dr. Michelson, like said something about this where about fasting in general, that if he said, if I had been studying a new drug and got these results, I would certainly be getting calls every day with proposals, financial aid, and money for research. And then what you just said, like in terms of challenging anybody to come up with a cocktail of drugs that would have this potent effect. And so the big problem to me is like, how has the government not already rallied around and give hundreds of millions of funding? And I mean, you're talking about something that has the potential to be one of the bigger game changers in terms of half the population is going to get cancer. And so why would there not be tons of funding being thrown behind this?
Well, the system is not set up like that, right? So the NIH has actually funded the research, the basic research, very well, right? So we've always been very well funded for mouse research. The problem is when you try to make it to the next level, you're right, the pharmaceutical world has a system where they look at, stepwise. Let's say for breast cancer, it used to be just fulvestrant. Then you develop something that's called CDK4/6 inhibitors. You add that. Then, 5 years from now, you're going to add something else. And 20 years from now, you're going to add something else. It's very slow, but it's a money-making operation that nobody wants to touch, right? So, so we got very upset. For example, 3 or 4 years ago, I put together a team that had Debu Tripathi, MD Anderson, Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, UCSF. It was like an all-star group, right? It is the best that you can think of in the world. And twice we didn't get funded for the clinical trial. And what I just told you, like hormone therapy plus fasting mimicking that, we were all like shocked. How could it be, right? How could it be that all these hospitals get together? I mean, the heads of breast cancer, this is like the leader in that particular already leading center said, yes, let's do this. And twice the government panels, of course, full of people that are very much supporting drugs, did not fund it. But so of course, we were not trying to replace drugs. We were trying to do it in addition to the drugs. But certainly, the field is really set on adding one drug, right? And so that's the scientific community is thinking, come on, let's just think about the next drug that is called solve the problem that the two drugs couldn't solve, right?
That's such a weird way of thinking.
Yeah, but,
I mean, it's just strange.
As you know, if you read my book, I call it unconspired conspiracy, right? So, meaning that, big food, big pharma, big health. So there is, I'm part of this documentary, and Marion Nestle in the documentary says,
Marion Nestle, she was on this podcast, yeah.
Yeah, she basically says nobody benefits from, people being healthier, other than, nobody wants to see that, other than, say, nonprofit organizations, right? Everybody else, or a lot of, companies don't, the system is generating lots of money the way it is. And, and it's not like they want people to die of cancer or they want people to die of diabetes, or it's not it, but they're just not doing anything. They're not motivated to come up with something different.
Well, so last year, how much grant money was put towards, or funding was put towards pharmaceutical research around cancer?
It's not pharmaceutical research, but it's certainly, I would say, probably 99% of the money, or at least 95%. It's going to the type of research for which the endpoint is going to be a drug, right? So it may have been like cellular work, it might be
Like
mouse work.
how much in terms of, is it millions, billions?
No, billions.
Like what do you
many
mean?
billions.
Like
yeah.
many billions.
Yeah, I forgot what the just the National Cancer Institute, but it's not. Then there is the DoD, the Department of Defense, and probably I don't know how many, but more than 10 billion. Yeah,
More than 10 billion?
yeah, every year, probably more than 20 billion every year goes to cancer research, and just a small fraction of that goes to alternative ways.
So I'm just like wrapping my head around these numbers, because we're like, okay, how much money is going to pharmaceutical research for cancer? Like 10 billion. And then I was listening to your episode with Rich Roll, and you're applying for a grant for
$15 million. Yeah,
50 million. 15 million.
Yeah, with all these hospitals. By the way.
So I'm just trying to track this. You've come out with this thing that is very promising, that if you put a whole cocktail of drugs, it's so far like supersedes that, and you're just applying for 15 million. That just sounds
and
ridiculous.
it wasn't me. It was the biggest American cancer centers, right? If it was me, you could say, okay, you have an idea. Yeah. No, this was like the best of breast cancer in America, right? And still, nothing.
I mean, that's just insane. I mean, I feel like that's just capitalism at work in a nutshell. I mean, Casey Means was on the podcast last summer, and she was just talking about there's just like an incentive problem with all of this. And you said unconspired conspiracy, which is interesting, that use of terminology, because at the end of the day, what's driving people is profit and money. And what you're talking about with fasting is like a natural cure. There's no like drug money to be made. And so it's much more appealing of like, oh, let's create some drug that's going to like help cure cancer or something, and then we make billions of dollars off of it, versus, hey, this is something that people can implement in their life, and people aren't really going to make money off of it. And so the incentive there is just not the same. And so
I started a company. I donate everything to charity. But I did it because I thought that was the only way to compete with this system, right? And I was right? I was right. So luckily, because I started the company, and though the company is very, very small compared to these big pharmaceutical companies, is able to at least provide, let's say, the fasting mimicking diet for the university centers to do the clinical trials. Because if we didn't have the company, none of these trials would have been done, whether it was diabetes or autoimmunities or cancer. So I think I did the right thing. And but even in that case, you have to please the investors, right? You have to please the investors, and you have to make sure that everybody's happy, which for me is a very difficult terrain to navigate, because of course I'm thinking of the patient, but the investors are thinking about how much money we're gonna make out of this, right? But that's the game, right?
How about just think about like curing people of cancer? I mean, that sounds like a good motivator, no?
That doesn't work with them. It's just, once you get in that world, it's shocking, right? It's just quarterly reports, right? And how have you done this quarter? And that's it, right? This is why, but the company, I think it's important because the investors, if it's guided in the right direction. Now this, for example, for diabetes, even though the company didn't put any money into it, but the universities did, and now we're getting to a conclusive set of evidence, right, with 5 or 6 clinical trials and fairly conclusive evidence. So now, because there is a company, and the company can provide this to doctors and to people, this can become a reality. So now, you want to do GLP-1 or you want to do the fasting mimicking diet. So this is now an option, right? And so, yeah, so I think that was the right move. And some people don't like it. Some people say, well, it's a conflict of interest. And I thought that that's the only way. I thought about, for example, there was laws that I think are still in effect where they say, a doctor cannot own a clinic, right? And then it turns out that the best performing clinics are those owned by doctors. Right? And why? Because the doctor cares about the patient, right? If you take it away from the doctor and you put it in the hands of somebody that cares about the money and only the money, now, the doctor may care about the money, but it also cares about the patient, right? So, it turns out that this has been studied that you want a doctor to be owner of a clinic, so I think, I will argue that you want many more professors, and I know everybody's going to be against me on this, but you want a lot of professors that are still active and keep them active because, as long as I'm active as a professor, I have a standard that I have to satisfy, right? And that sort of keeps me, I have to be ethical. I have to push the companies as hard as I can to be ethical. But most companies don't have that. They don't have a professor inside that says, no, you're not going to do this, right? So I would say, again, I might be alone in this group thinking like this, but I would say that every company should have a few people like that in it. It's major shareholders that, may not be able to use the shares, may have to donate the shares to charity because otherwise then I'm also aligned with making money, and then I may make the wrong choice.
Yeah, I can't imagine like how frustrating this must be for you because you've done the work, right? So you've done all these like mouse trials, and so if we were to think,
we've done 45 clinical trials.
Yeah,
45 trials, right? Clinical human trials.
So
we've done much more than mouse trials.
So what I'm saying is that in the mouse trials, you have like demonstrated that fasting can help cure cancer, well, if paired with other things. And so there's so much evidence of like what is actually happening in mice, which is like the first step. So then you move on to human trials, and you ask the question like, is this also going to be the case in human trials? And so from my perspective, I'm like, you could spend $20 billion on trying to come up with a new drug for cancer. Like a lot of that money might be wasted, right? But like this is like coming up with something that can be a complete game changer for people's health. And given that, again, 50% of the population is going to get cancer, just from the data, and this is becoming such a widespread thing. It's like so relevant to everybody's lives. It's such a personal thing. Like if you have a loved one who's going through cancer, if you get cancer, like the amount of emotional toll, the physical toll that like takes on you is so devastating. And so you've come up with this thing where it's like, it's just so, I can't imagine how frustrating that is. So you're coming out with something that could potentially be a huge game changer. And then you're going through all these like political loops and trying to get grants and fundings and all that stuff. It's tough.
We're moving it forward, but in a much slower pace, right? So I think we should have had 10 times more clinical trials, much larger trials, more cancers. So so now we have a trial that is starting with colorectal cancer, one trial that started with prostate cancer, several starting with breast cancer. But it's just very slow, and they're small trials. And then these are not conclusive trials. They're not 500 patient type of trials. They're like, 50 patient, 100 patient. And so, it's going to take them 3 or 4 years to finish those. And then the medical community is going to say, well, now you need to start a new trial with 500 patients. And so then it's another 10 years of work, right? Yeah, so it's happening, but it's happening so slow that I think, a lot of people that could benefit from the integration. And also, nobody's arguing that the drugs are not useful. We're using drugs in every trial. So it's not even that we're saying we're replacing the standard of care. We're saying we can make the standard of care work so much better. And but let us try that, right? So, and let us try it. And it's not going to work for everything. For most things, immunotherapy didn't work, but for some things, it works very well. And so, so that's strange that there wouldn't be a percentage of the funds put aside for integrative, alternative, thinking differently. It seems like all the money is going into the same ideas, right? And
What you found in the mouse trials, so you've done the 45 clinical ones, like have those findings?
45 human clinical trials.
Yeah. So with what you demonstrated first with the trials with mice, have those findings generally, even though the data set isn't extremely like large or what you would want it to be, like has that now been replicated in human, or it's starting to trend in that same direction?
Yeah, so the 40 or so trials are in all kinds of diseases, including normal people. So some of them are not even diseases, right? So for cancer, there's probably, I don't know, something like 15 clinical trials. So yeah, you're starting to see, as I was mentioning earlier, for example, for triple negative breast cancer, metastatic, you're starting to see the early data showing a doubling in survival, a doubling in what's called pathological complete response, so which is a surrogate for long-term survival. Yeah, so it seems to work, at least in the metastatic setting. The early use is not that clear, but we never really push, as we mentioned earlier. If somebody has stage 1 breast cancer and they have a 98% chance of being cured, in that case, we're basically saying, I don't know, maybe you shouldn't do it. Let's wait and see what the trials show. But yeah, in the metastatic cancers, I think that the early data is looking good, but it's still 1 or 2 cancers, and so it's. Clearly, in the mouse studies, this is now 10 different labs, if not more, showing it working for pancreatic, colorectal, prostate, breast, so all kinds of cancer, liver. So in the clinical trials, only a few have begun to test it, right? So what should have happened is that there should have been 20 different trials started every year, looking at the combination with lots of therapies for lots of cancers.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting with your work because cancer, as you're alluding to, isn't the only condition where fasting has shown promise. I mean, you've done research on autoimmune diseases as well, and I was looking into some of your comments about like multiple sclerosis and potentially some theories there. And so what have you discovered about MS, and then also, other potential conditions and how fasting might help?
Yeah, so for autoimmunity now we have a number. We and others have a number of papers in mice, for inflammatory bowel disease, so Crohn's, colitis, multiple sclerosis, and it keeps on working extremely well in the mouse models, right? So we're starting to say, well, this is not really about what the autoimmunity is attacking, right? But it's about the autoimmunity itself. So in those papers, we're showing that the fasting and fasting mimicking diet are basically preferentially killing the cells that are self-attacking, right? So it's going after the properties of autoimmunities rather than am I attacking the gut or am I attacking the spinal cord, et cetera, et cetera. And then the trial, the one on multiple sclerosis looks promising, but it's certainly not conclusive. And now we're going to see 2 trials, one University of Miami, one Stanford, on colitis and Crohn's. And I cannot talk about those, but they'll be published in the next. I think Miami is probably going to be published in the next couple of months, and then Stanford probably in the next 6 or 7 months. So you'll have to wait and see those. And so I think I would say, and then we have our own paper where we look at 13 different cases of autoimmunities that involve lots of different autoimmunities. So I would say that we're gonna see good data on autoimmunities in the next 12 months. That looks very promising, and then, of course, diabetes and prediabetes and obesity. I think the FMD is the way to go, and I think that that should be tried for people in those categories before the GLP-1 type drugs. And then, of course, some people are going to need GLP-1 drugs but I think it should come after. And I just wrote an article. I like the combination of the three things, right? So I like the 12-hour time restricted eating, right? The safe kind, and then what I call the longevity diet, and then the fasting mimicking diet. I think those three should be tried and this is what we do in the foundation clinics. This is what the team of doctors and nutritionists does, is to personalize it. Say, some people say, I don't want to do the fasting mimicking diet. Okay, then we just allow them to do time restricted eating, 12 hours, and then the longevity diet. The longevity diet is a pescatarian, sort of between the Okinawa diet and the Mediterranean diet and the Loma Linda. So it's a mixture of things, but it's just focused on, it's everyday diet focused on mechanisms. And let's not just talk about something that was in the Mediterranean area or it was in Okinawa, but something that is combining this with the science, or all kinds of other science. So then I think for diabetes, prediabetes, and obesity, that's what should be done. If that fails, if using these three tools in different combination or together, some people, we do it together. So for example, in this big trial in southern Italy, we're combining the longevity diet and the fasting mimicking diet, and we do it now, and this is almost finished. We're the last 10 patients of 500 patient trials. So it's the biggest trial we've ever done. Yeah. And so we'll see now. So one group does nothing, one group does a fasting mimicking diet every 3 months, and one group did fasting mimicking diet plus the longevity diet plus time restricted eating, right? So we'll see the results. But I think that's probably, to me, is what works well. And what we see over and over in the trials is that we see that, so if you do GLP-1 receptor agonist, Mounjaro, Ozempic, you see that, people lose fat, people lose muscle. There's a lot of side effects. And then if they stop the drug, they regain the weight, right? When you do this combination of these diets, you don't just see them losing. First of all, they lose the fat, they lose a lot less muscle, or they don't lose muscle, and then you start seeing drug reduction, right? So you're really making them healthy again. So, and that's between all three trials showing about between 60 and 70% of patients reduce drug use. And I think about 15% of the patients go to no drugs at all, right? So that's what you want, right? You want them to become healthier. But the interesting thing is not only they reduce the diabetic drug use, but they reduce the hypertension drug use, right? So it's multi-systemic, restoration of health, right? So now they're becoming less dependent on drugs to block different problems that they have.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I said up front, why, people have heard the term fasting and that is a popular thing, but when I say why haven't people heard about this, in the sense of the work that you're doing is incredibly significant in terms of the far-ranging impact for humanity and even what that can mean about disease and other things for humans. And the crazy part is just if there's a pharmaceutical drug isn't going to heal your body. It's incapable of doing that. And so at most
but there is no incentive financially to cure it, right? If you cure somebody,
well,
that's you start selling the drug, right? That's a problem, right? There is no incentive by a pharmaceutical company to cure anything, right?
But another guest we had on was Dr. Robert Lustig, and so he was his book came out a few years ago, but we were just talking about all these kind of cellular processes that are happening in the body that contribute obviously to aging and longevity, and how nutrition, or in this case fasting or exercise, would interact with all of those processes and actually act as an agent to heal and regenerate and offset potential accelerated accelerating aging. But when it comes to pharmaceutical drugs, all they're doing is coming in and essentially reducing or masking symptoms, creating more comfort potentially in somebody's body. And then also you have all these side effects. And so from a human standpoint, it's just, there's no comparison. It's just so far exceeds of like what humanity actually needs versus we're basically putting a Band-Aid on a lot of these things. And that's not to say that some of these drugs are not very powerful, and they are life-changing interventions for people who are incredibly desperate, but we just don't think about how do we actually like heal a person? How do we actually not just create a long life, but like a thriving life? And that's what I really admire about like your foundation, is because that's just undeniably a direction that we need to move in, but we just have this huge political system that is kind of standing in the way. So
yeah, political and financial, right? So I think that if you look at the drug world, it's almost like they brainwash the scientific community into thinking that's where the sophistication is, right? So if you're now working on a drug, we almost get discriminated. To me, it's entertaining because I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, do you think that I can also work on drugs? Why don't I work on drugs, right? Because what you just said, right? I want something that is 3 billion years old, right? I want something that is so sophisticated, it's so much more powerful than a drug. If you damage a kidney or pancreas or lots of different organs and systems, let's say insulin resistance, prediabetes, diabetes, metabolic syndrome. I mean, these are complex problems, right? And you don't just get in there and say, I'm just going to activate this receptor or GLP-1, and that's how I solve the problem, right? Well, yes, you might solve the problem for some people. What the compliance, after 1 year, over 70%, or after 2 years, over 70% of people on GLP-1 receptor agonists drop it, right? So most people, and we already know that if you drop it, you're going to regain the weight. This is what it's an illusion, right? And so I think that not only it's not sophisticated, but it's not really solving anybody's problem. And it's just putting a temporary improvement that is very tempting, because of course you inject yourself and you lose all this weight and you think, this is great, right? And then, of course, you're going to drop out of it. And so, no, it's not great, right? It would have been great at least if you did it and then you kept these benefits and you did not lose muscle. But yeah, so the idea is that sophisticated. And if you have a fasting mimicking diet or fasting or time-restricted eating, that's not so sophisticated. That's, that's not very technological. Right?
It's funny because people hated dogma in religion for so long, and there's good reason for that. I think when you just start saying things and saying we need to operate under the system and there's a certain way of rules or whatever, so pointing that as a good thing. But I've realized as I've looked into the scientific community and the differences between what science actually is, and then like the cycle that we're stuck in the scientific community, and especially in the West in the 21st century, is there seem to be a lot of dogma in the sense of like science is at its best when it's pushing the bounds of like what's actually possible. And so we're just like stuck in these mindsets of like, no, this is only what we do. Like we can only do this thing. And then when you were just saying about like brainwashing the scientific community, it's just like, no, this is what science is, and this is only what's possible. And we need to have a breakthrough through these methods over here. And we're just not going to explore this, even if there's crazy amount of research that is very promising around it. And it's just kind of sad because it is essentially doing the same thing that people complain about with religion. It's putting everything in a box and saying this is what science is, and this is the way that we do things.
Yeah. And now when you have by far the most expensive healthcare system in the world, right? I think twice as expensive as that of Switzerland. And you're ranked anywhere between 50th and 70th in the world for healthcare quality.
Which is absurd, yeah.
You think it'd be people on the street, right? And saying, hey, we're done with this. But no, it's just remarkable, right? If it happened for anything else, you will have a revolution. But somehow, probably because the universities and the system has approved this. It's like, okay, this is the way to go, right? Well, we're 70th in the world. We're doing a terrible job in healthcare. And people are, living for 30 or 40 years full of drugs. I mean, the average 60-year-old takes 3, 4, 5 drugs a day, right?
Yeah.
So they're just loaded with drugs, miserable, and then, end up broke because, eventually you're going to develop one or more of these, chronic diseases. And maybe your insurance is going to run out. That's not a good system, right? You figure that if anywhere in the world there should be a revolution, it should be in the United States, because at least Italy or Colombia, they get about, Italy is much higher ranked, but I think one of the countries I mentioned was, I think it was Colombia, and they're, maybe around the same level, but it costs so much less for the same type of quality, right? So at least you say, okay, I don't have the best healthcare in the world, but I don't really pay very much for it. But to have a bad healthcare by any type of judgment, meaning even the Americans are saying that the healthcare system is terrible here. So you have a bad healthcare system. You pay 10 times more than Colombia, but you're ranked about as bad as Colombia.
I mean, it's kind of I would call it like a spiritual crisis in America, and what I mean by that really is like we're just obsessed with money, and so like if that is our highest value or goal in life is to make money, and that's our, whatever you want to call it, our higher power or whatever, then everything we're going to do is going to orient around how do I make more money, and so we're not going to look towards other people and be like, well, how can I help them cure their disease that they're suffering from? It's like, no, like how can I make the most money? And so it's just like a spiritual crisis. It's like a values thing of like, what is our highest priority in life? And it's just kind of sad if like the incentive system would stay the same. It's like, well, I just want to get rich instead of curing people.
Yeah, it's not just rich, but I think it's the whole system now. Everybody is part of the money making group, and so different people at different levels of this network are happy with the way the system is. But then eventually, the most important thing they have, which is their health, I would speculate, is not good, right? So, well, what are you going to use that money for? So if you're unhealthy and if you're chronically sick and you're not going to live very long, why is it that wouldn't it probably be better to be poor and healthy than rich and chronically sick?
Yeah, what's the point? Your quality of life. So I mean, we have like 15 minutes. Where I wanted to land this is like, so if the average person is listening and they're interested in the possibilities of fasting or the fasting mimicking diet, because there's just so much nuance on this. We talked about the good, the bad, the neutral. So if the average person with average health wants to interact with this in some sort of way, what would be like your recommendation or a starting point for like, is there benefit in a kind of protective mechanism if you don't even have a disease and you want to start implementing these things in your life? Like, what would you say? So,
yeah, I would say that now we have very clear evidence, right, from multiple pillars, right? So this is not just an idea that is mine or somebody else. I mean, it's very clear that now we have meta-analysis and big studies here, say close by Harvard, and so. For example, a diet that is high in whole grains, in legumes, in vegetables, some fruit, some fish, no red meat or very low red meat, generally low white meat, and that alone, if started at age 20, is associated with 11 to 13 years of life expectancy increase, right? Compared to, let's say, a typical Western diet. Mm-hmm. If you start at 60, is 8 to 9 years. If you start at 80, it's 3 to 4 years. Even if you just have the bad diet until 80, and then you decide to switch, that's still 3 to 4 years. It's an association, but this is over and over and over, so it's very clear. And that's just the everyday diet, right? So some people could say, okay, I want to do that. Great. So you're probably going to get the benefits that we just discussed, which are big. So this is life expectancy. Then with it comes 30, 40, 50 years of much healthier, right? So you're not just living longer. For 11 years, you're going to live healthier maybe for 30 or 40 years, right? So it's a big benefit. But some people say, no, I don't care. I want a Western diet. I want to eat steaks all day long and fries. And okay. Well, first of all, if you do what I call the longevity diet, which is what I just sort of described, into that I would say, say fish added 3 or 4 times a week, just because otherwise vegans tend to be malnourished. I mean, a lot of vegans are fine. You don't need to be pescatarian to be healthy, but it's harder, right? So say if you go out there and you tell 100 people be vegan, you're going to have a portion of that they're going to be malnourished, right? So to avoid that, I think is pescatarian. It's not necessary, but it's probably a good idea. So then to that you will. Our advice in the foundation clinics is the 12 hours time restricted eating and the fasting mimicking diet, maybe 2 to 3 times a year. But then I think
5 days.
For 5 days, 2 to 3 times a year. Okay. So it's like 10 to 15 days a year. You're gonna dedicate it to a plant-based fasting mimicking diet. And so those are the 3 things. And then as people come into the clinic, the foundation clinic. Some people say, I don't want to do the fasting mimicking diet. Some people say, I don't want to do the longevity diet. Some people say, I don't want to do the time restricted eating because I live in Spain and we go out and eat at 11 p.m. So you get all kinds of people, and you just have to find what's best for them. That's one. And then personalize. Like some people are going to be fine with, all the things we're saying. Some people are going to eat legumes and they're going to have a terrible time, right? Some people are going to have a terrible time with legumes early, but then they're going to adapt because their microbiota adapts to the legumes, right? So the recommendation is, talk to people that know what they're doing, like a nutritionist or physician that are specialized. You don't need to do this all the time, but I think it's good to, because there is a lot of nuances and a lot of things that can make a big difference. So for example, we always try, the dietitians always attempt to get the people there slowly, right? So a lot of places, a lot of dietitians around the world will just throw at you this diet, like do this from now on, right? So we always say this is not good, right? So try to make small changes until you get there, because some of these changes are not going to be suitable for a particular person, and then you want to avoid it, and that's most likely that person then going to stick with the new plan. So these 3 things together, I think, and of course the exercise, 150 minutes of exercise and 1 hour a day of walking, and people don't do that anymore. I mean, New York City, maybe a little bit more, but
10,000 steps, or
something like 10,000 steps plus the 150 minutes, right? It's not instead of, right? So 10,000 steps a day or so plus 150 minutes of exercise
a week.
A week, yeah.
So that's only like 20 minutes.
Every day.
That's not even that much.
No, 25 minutes a day. Yeah, but if you can do exercise 25 minutes a day, plus you do an hour walking, that's good. And by the way, if you do 45 minutes, the benefits are not that much higher, right? I mean, they're a little bit higher, but not that much higher, right? So this is why I like the 150 and I like the 12 hours because, you could do more hours and you get more benefits with fasting or with exercise. But it seems like that is the optimization of easy to do. Yeah. Anybody who's going to complain about 25 minutes, say I do 45 minutes every other day. Okay, so it's very straightforward, and it's going to change your life. Yeah.
If someone's very insistent upon water fasting, what would you say to them?
Yeah, what I said earlier, right? So. You have to realize what the potential side effects are. You have to realize what the difficulties are. But if you like it, and you're willing to take the risk, and also different risks for different people. Somebody may say, in my family we've been doing this for 4 generations. You can't argue with somebody like that, right? They say we've been doing water only fasting for 4 generations, once every 3 months. Okay, so that's different than somebody that's never done it all of a sudden say, I'm going to start doing water-only fasting for 10 days, right? So yeah, so I would say if you do that, you should do it in a clinic, and you should ask questions about what are the long-term effects, right? Where is the data showing me what happens to me a week after, a month after, 2 months after, 1 year after, right? That's the type of question you need to ask her, because it's pointless if I get you from A to B in 10 days or A to B in 3 weeks. If then, 6 months later, I made your life worse. And I'm not saying that's the case. I'm saying we need to see the data, right? And so for the fasting mimicking diet and the longevity diet, we've been doing this. So for example, in the Italian trial with 500 people, we're now following up with a second trial where we're going to have about 200 people, and we're going to follow them for another year. So now we have 6 months, and we're going to add a year to it. So now we have a year and a half of observation, right? We want to see not just, we were successful. Like, yeah, we were successful, but were you successful, right? Did you keep it, right? Did you keep whatever benefit you gained in those 6 months? Because, this pharmaceutical world got used to doing the opposite. Let's just show big effects, right? Because we're not really thinking about necessarily your long-term health. We just want to get FDA approval.
A short-term effect.
Short-term, get the biggest benefit and get it approved. Then, if in 2 years you're going to drop out of this GLP-1, it's okay, right? We have approval and a lot of people are using it.
How would you, the big thing for people with water fasting or even the fasting mimicking diet, and now you're under calorie restriction, the whole reason why Ozempic is popular is because people really struggle with their food cravings. And even when you think about the idea of, a lot of ultra processed food is super addictive and people are in these eating habits where they're just running to food. And so if someone's going to adopt one of these things, like what would you say about the psychological component of that?
I would say that that's good, right? That's the opposite of what you think, that in the 50s and 60s, I was just reading these articles about the person, I forget his name, that came up with the idea of exercise. Right? People didn't exercise in the 50s. It didn't exist, right? So somebody wrote a book, and it's probably not the only source, but and then all of a sudden, slowly, people start exercising. And if you think about that, this is something that I just mentioned, I say 150 minutes a week, right? That's a lot of effort, right? So if you think about the mentality of somebody in the United States in the 1950s, and you say, hey, I got a solution for you, you're gonna have to do 150 minutes a week of exercise, they would have thought you're completely crazy. And it's never gonna happen, right? This is impossible. Sure enough, now about half of Americans and half of Europeans are doing 150 minutes a week of some type of exercise. It's unbelievable, right? It's not 100%, it's 50%. But that's very impressive. Much harder than, let's say, fasting mimicking diet 3 times a year, or 12-hour time restricted eating, or switching as much as you can to the longevity diet. Yeah, so people, we're underestimating, A, what people can do, and B, how much better they're going to feel just by doing, even if there was a pill, they could substitute it. Even if these pills that are out there could do all of it, and they cannot, you still want to put that effort. Understanding that if I said, no, it's not 150 minutes, it's 1,500 minutes a week. Okay, now you got a problem, right? And now people say, this is crazy, I cannot do this, this is too much. It's not 20 minutes, 200 minutes a day of exercise. Yeah, so I think that as long as it's reasonable and it makes people feel better, I think you're gonna get that 50% effect, right? So 50% of people eventually will gravitate. You're gonna need more and more data, right, about the 12 hours, about the longevity diet, about the fasting mimicking diet, and other things that are out there. Those are the ones I like, but I think there are others. But I haven't seen anything solid, right, that other than those 4, right, including the exercise and the 5, 1 hour a day of walking. But there are other things, and I think eventually, they're very consistent with modern life. But I think also psychologically, they're very consistent with benefits, psychological benefits that should not be underestimated, and which you're not going to get. And there is certainly, papers that are suggesting that, depression and anxiety and suicide rates. there's contrasting, but certainly there are papers showing increase in those taking certain drugs for weight loss, for example.
My last question would be, we've covered a lot of ground, but moving forward, just like as a visionary, like what is the world that you see? What is the world that you want to move forward to? Because you're at the intersection of a lot of big ideas, and I'm sure this goes through your head all the time.
Yeah, I think that a big success. I always remember when Zuckerberg used to say, "Well, it'd be nice if 1 billion people had Facebook," right? Yeah, and so I think now maybe 1 billion people are connected to Facebook. Yeah, so I think it'd be nice if 1 billion people sort of followed all these things and said, now it's not going to be everybody, but that 1 billion people could say, "Hey, I'm living the next 20 years, life expectancy increase." Much healthier, and maybe out of that, half of them, and this is what we see, for example, of people in Ecuador, and that they never go to the hospital, right? And we didn't talk about that, but so we know that it's possible, right? It's possible that people can stay away from the hospital for their entire lives. Yes, not everybody, but is it possible for 30, 40, 50% of these billion people? That would be remarkable, right? Now you have 400 million people that never went to the hospital, right? They live a healthy life, and then they die they get worse and die very rapidly when they're 110, right? Yeah, so that to me is that would be success.
Yeah, really beautiful. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
It's a great conversation. Thank you.